Sorry, I don't love you. Afraid I've grown accustomed to. Cause with you something isn't wrong, something isn't wrong, something isn't right. I wish you could be.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back, and we have a brand new guest today. We're talking all about Solo, a Star Wars story with Katie Schaefer. Katie, would you like to introduce yourself since it is your first time on the podcast?
Sure. I've been writing movie and film pieces for quite some time, but I've been getting published with Substream for a little over a year now. I like all kinds of film, and I watch a huge variety from bad movies to superheroes to crazy 70s, 60s art films. And I'm super excited to talk to you about Solo. I've been a huge Star Wars fan my whole life, so I really look forward to it.
Yeah, see, I got into Star Wars a lot more recently. I had watched, the initial 6 films, and when they had the announcement that The Force Awakens was going to be coming out and they were going to basically be reviving the Star Wars universe in a sense, I was like, okay, let me go back and I'll just watch the original trilogy. And then I really just got sucked in from there. So, I do not mind all of the Star Wars content lately, especially the books and comics, because I am also a nerd about those things. But I wouldn't consider myself a Star Wars expert by any means. Sometimes I'm still like, wait, what planet did this happen on? Where are we going? What's happening? So, I dive in, but I am by no means, the best person to ask specific facts about the Star Wars universe. So I'm very glad that you are on to discuss Solo today. Wow. Well, and Star Wars, same thing. Here we go.
Right? It's all one big happy family.
Exactly.
I've been watching the movies since I was very small. My parents are huge Star Wars and Star Trek nerds, so they introduced me to it. And I've watched the movies I don't know how many times, and I got my niece into it and my son, and so it's kind of it's a big thing. But I only got into the exterior universe a little bit, but I know the films really, really well. So
Well, good news. I have only covered the recent films, so we'll probably have you back on to cover something in the original trilogy, if not the whole original trilogy. Who knows? Although we will definitely split that up into 3 episodes. I would not sit down and discuss the entire trilogy in one episode. We'd be here for a
I
long time.
that's just too much, and I would love that. So you saw Solo, and what were your initial thoughts? Because my feelings on it really developed as I sat and thought about it from after I left the theater.
Going into it, I had heard mixed reviews from critics and whatnot, and I knew that it wasn't doing super well in theaters. Like when I went, there were 4 other people in the theater, and that was it, which
Ooh,
I kind of like that because then I don't really have to be annoyed by people making a bunch of noise during a movie.
that's
So,
true.
I don't mind that as much, but I know it's not great for the movies, especially since I saw it week 2 or 3 that it was out. It's not like it had been out for over a month or something and it was that empty. But, I sort of just didn't give myself too many expectations going into it because for me, Star Wars, it's something that I've enjoyed to varying degrees. There have been some of the books that I haven't liked as much as others, and then I've for the most part really enjoyed the new movies. So going into this, I was like, you know what? If I enjoy it, great. If not, I used Movie Pass. It's not the end of the world. So,
Right.
I did have fun with it though. So it was sort of just a relief to not be a Star Wars nerd to the extent that I know other fans can be, because I feel like that allows me to sort of just sit back and enjoy things a little more than some of the really big hardcore fans.
Right. I can totally see that. And if you follow film Twitter, it's such a complicated thing to be a Star Wars fan these days.
Yes.
I mean, I went into it with pretty much the same attitude, even with my lifelong love. Like I was like, this is going to be a really hard shot to make. Like not to make a bad joke, not unlike the Kessel Run. Like you're gonna have to pull it off really, really well in order to hit that sweet spot for fans and people who aren't huge Star Wars nerds. And I thought, they did a decent job, but I think I don't know that it would have ever made anybody or everybody happy.
Plus, The Last Jedi didn't even make everyone happy. So it's just one of those things where I think people are just going to have to accept that there are going to be Star Wars decisions that they don't like and others that are perfectly fine and line up with what those fans like. But we could probably go down a very big rabbit hole if we continue talking about the online fandom of Star
Right,
Wars.
right.
So,
That's true.
so why don't we go ahead and just dive on in and talk about the casting? Because, like you said, this movie, it was difficult because you have someone else playing Han Solo, and all we've known is Harrison Ford as Han Solo. And it's one of those things where, to me, it feels a little similar to having to follow up like Heath Ledger's Joker performance. To me,
Yeah,
it's like, okay, that's the Joker for the live action movies, and Mark
right,
Hamill is the Joker for the animated series, and you have those
right.
two very great depictions of the Joker, and it's like, are you really expecting anyone to ever stand up to those performances, basically? And for me, the answer is probably no. So I wasn't expecting this to be like, oh, this guy reminds me exactly of Harrison Ford playing Han Solo, because that's not a thing that's going to happen.
Right. And I totally agree. I think that, eh, and it would be if Heath Ledger had played the Joker in like six movies and had like started his career out playing. Like Harrison Ford and Han Solo are so intertwined in people's minds that it's going to be almost impossible for you to get out from under that unless you make some really conscious decisions and play it your own way. And you know, I think he looks the part. I think Alan Ehrenreich looks perfect for a younger Solo, as close as you can get to Harrison Ford. I mean,
Yeah, I think they definitely did everything they could to have this really look and feel like a Star Wars movie with Han Solo and Lando and all of the other characters. And, Donald Glover is another person that we will definitely be talking about throughout this
definitely.
episode. But then you have Amelia Clark as Kira, Woody Harrelson as Beckett, and you have, Phoebe Waller Bridge voicing L3.
Oh, that was such a good choice.
Yeah, and then you have Paul Bettany as Dryden Voss. You have all of these familiar faces in this movie that I think help sort of bolster the fact that, okay, Alden Ehrenreich is no Harrison Ford, but that's okay.
Yeah, exactly. I didn't need him to be Harrison Ford
Yeah.
because the Han Solo we're seeing isn't the Han Solo from the movies that we saw. Like that Han Solo is 10 to 15 years older than this guy, and he's obviously gone through some really big life changes since then and done some crazy things. So he's going to be a different person, and it's okay. It's a movie. I'm happy to see a new iteration and see how well they can pull it off.
I do want to point out too that the reason this movie looked like it wasn't doing well at the box office is because of how much of it they had to redo to an extent once you had the firings and everything like that. So
Yeah.
it's not even
Okay.
it's not even really the fault of the actors for this movie not being a hit in the theaters. It's like, okay, that decision was not theirs, and they ended up having to do extra work. So, of course, everyone's going to have to get paid for all of that extra work, and it's going to increase the budget a ton. And I think the casual fan might not realize that if they don't keep up, with like the business side of movie news and everything like that. So just looking at the numbers, you're like, oh, that's not great. But when you sort of put it into context, you're like, oh, well, that's why.
Right. That's very true. Like I heard about it and was like, that seems weird. That movie was not a $200 million movie, and they're gonna hit. Like, it's silly to talk about a movie making over $100 million and still it's not a success, or whatever. It's still like you make in the tens and millions of dollars, your movie is a success. That's a big deal. Just because it's not a Force Awakens or whatever, it doesn't mean that it's not a successful or good movie. And I think there are these high expectations because of what Star Wars is, and I don't think that it would be necessarily considered such a, you know, or be looked at like it's not succeeding, um, without what you said, like the budgets and the reshoots and how it got so much because of those are the costs of making movies.
Yeah, Hollywood is just weird in general. I was actually reading an article earlier today about the DC movies, and it was like, yeah, Justice League was a failure, but it made over $600 million. I was like, well, if you think $600 million is a failure, please give me the money. I'll take it.
Yeah, I will take it. I will take half that. You can keep the other half.
I
Like,
would take like 1% of that and
yeah,
literally be fine.
and I think that, and with Justice League, it's the same thing. Like, and that movie was, you know, it's a failure in some ways, but that doesn't, like, money isn't what constitutes success, but it does on some levels. Like, the enjoyability of a movie can't be judged by how much money is spent or earned,
Right.
but it, the money is what a certain section of Hollywood cares about, and that's how we decide. That's how it's decided whether or not we get more of a thing. So,
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the things I want to talk about here, because it's a big part of the movie, is when Han and Chewie initially meet. Because for me, I think I was like, okay, this could go a lot of different ways, but I think the way it went was like, oh, yeah, this makes sense.
I totally agree. That for me was the most important relationship in that whole movie. Like, the love story that's going on took such a backseat to the friendship that's developing between the two of them and how natural it was. And I thought those two had the best chemistry in the film. I mean, sure, you can't really see a whole lot of facial movement, but I think the actor who took over from the original Chewbacca actor, whose name is escaping me right now, Peter Mayhew, um, did a fantastic job. Like, he still comes off like the same Wookiee.
Yeah, and you have Han trying to speak to him in what is it called? I believe it's Shuriwook. I might be
Yes.
pronouncing that
Yep.
incorrectly. I feel like I pronounce all of the Star Wars words incorrectly anyway. I'm just like I
You
don't
just
I
gotta
don't
do
know.
that.
It's just made up. So, he was speaking in Chewie's language, and that provides enough comedy for me in that moment. I'm like, yeah, of course he would know some words, but they wouldn't really make sense. And I love how they give us the translation for Han, but not for Chewie, because it's like,
Yep.
it's Chewie is acted so well that you don't really need to ever know what Chewie is saying. And I think that's part of what has made that character so likable over the years.
Yeah, and I think um, the contrast between how, like, soft and fuzzy and lovable he is, and yet how he's still this very dangerous creature, is works so to his benefit, because it also allows him to do a lot of nuance with the vocal intonations and little facial movement they give him and the arms and his body language, and it becomes like a character that is my son. He was my son's favorite for a while when he was little.
Yeah, it's just one of those things where they either nail it or they don't. And I'm really glad that they got that nailed down and fairly early on in the movie, too. We start out with this sort of big, grungy war scene, and then it sort of quickly changes pace after that. Once he's thrown down there with Chewie, it's like, okay, here we go. This is sort of where everything is coming together, and we're going to see how Han and Chewie wind up sticking by each other's sides for so long. And it was just a really well done storyline. But
Yeah.
I do want to touch on Lando and L3 here too, because I think that's another relationship that might not have been as expected as Han and Chewie's, but still
Nope.
had
That's,
some sort of importance to the story.
well, the one more thing about the Han and Chewie, I think that initial scene between them is so powerful and gives you like it gives them a bond that makes it so reasonable that, like, everything else that comes afterwards, like, oh, okay, this all makes sense. This, willing to sacrifice themselves for each other is okay. You believe it, becomes believable. And I think that also ties in with Lando and L3. Like, at first, it seems very odd that the two of them are, in a ship together, but as we learn more about their relationship, it all becomes very natural and it seems so unaffected between Donald Glover and the robot, essentially.
Yeah, and we have that scene when L3 basically starts this droid rebellion,
Oh,
and
it was
they're
so good.
yeah, and you see what Lando risks just to get L3 out of there. And even though things do not go so well for L3 in the end, she still becomes part of the ship. And I think that's ultimately what makes that such a sort of touching relationship, even though it's between a person and a robot. I mean, they still find a way to make you care about this relationship.
Right. And the conversations, like I thought L3 was such an advancement of the droids as, a species as it were. And like her conversation about Lando with um Kira is funny and kind of shocking. And for a minute you sit there thinking like, does she really okay. And like all of the talk you hear about the pansexuality of Lando and stuff, like all of a sudden I was like, oh, okay, this is what they meant by that. I see. Okay.
Exactly. And it's one of those things where, Star Wars always has some sort of comedic relief, even in the most dire of situations. And L3 provided a good amount of that, even though she wasn't on screen too terribly long. Like when we first see the droid, she is basically attacking people for fighting droids again, like in
Yep.
a I forget what the name of the show is, but it's like the Battle of the Robots show. And
Yep. Yep.
it was
Yep.
like that. And, Lando literally has to like get her out of there before she
Right.
causes too much of a scene. And the
Like we're
amount of
leaving now. You have to escort her out of it.
yeah, and the amount of personality that they gave the droid, it was similar to what they did with K2SO in Rogue One, but it was still so different.
Right. It feels more developed. It feels less like a fun gimmick, like meant to entice the children in the audience almost. This felt, I think, that makes me think that like Solo is somewhere in between like the typical like tone of a Star Wars film that's usually it's not too dark, and then Rogue One, which did go pretty dark considering the end. And this one feels a little more in the middle with the grunginess and these are criminals doing their fun criminal things. And L3 felt like a good exploration of that because she's essentially like a militant, and that I thought was such a great choice to make for her.
Right. Plus, with Lando, the way that Donald Glover portrayed the character felt like a very good fit. It's like we could imagine this just being Lando from the other movies, and his obsession with his capes was perfect too. I really enjoyed
Oh,
that. It's like, yes, this is exactly what we would expect from Lando.
the cape closet, when they go in that cape closet, I was like, this is correct. This is how these things should be. And I think, do you know the quote about what, when asked how he portrayed Lando, what Billy D. Williams said?
I do think I saw that floating around. I don't remember what it was exactly, though.
It's, he looked at it as he was just a brother in space doing his thing.
Yeah.
And that was very much how I felt Donald Glover approached the role. At least, I don't know if it was. I haven't read an interview where he said that specifically, but that's what it felt like. Like he was just being, this idea of a spacefaring, brother doing what he wanted to do, and it felt very natural, and only a little inspired by Billy D. Williams' character.
Yeah, and I want to quickly touch on Kira and Dryden Voss here because, Dryden Voss felt like a very typical villain, and we didn't see him too terribly much, but it was more so his relationship with Kira that sort of took over the storyline because you have her killing him, and then, obviously spoilers if you're already listening this far, but
Yeah, I was wondering if we'd get to talk about this. This was like the most interesting part of these were some of the most interesting choices they made in the movie, this end scene here.
yeah, and then she calls up Darth Maul, and I'm like, wait, what? Hello, explanation, please. So, they sort
Right.
of leave these loose ends that they are probably going to return to, whether or not that ends up being in a solo sequel or just in some other way in a different movie down the line. It'll be interesting to see because that's something you're like, okay, Crimson Dawn. obviously Crimson Red. Okay, this is starting to make sense. And then you
Yep.
see Darth Maul and you're like, oh no, they have to do some explaining here at some point.
Right. And I felt like that was like, I was very conflicted when I saw that because part of it is both good and bad. The idea of going and tying in this story to all the other stories. It's both a very Star Wars thing to do because it does do its best to try to feel like a complete universe, like everything interlaces with itself, like our own universe. But sometimes it comes across as very like fan servicey, and so I felt both in that instance. I was like, okay, this is an interesting choice to make, but why did you make it? Because for some reason that matters to me.
Yeah, and we obviously know where Han and Chewie end up down the line. So, you wouldn't even necessarily need to have the two of them in the story to finish off that portion of it somewhere down the line. And I think they did that for a reason too, because, Kira goes and she takes the ship and she leaves by herself.
Right.
So you're kind of like, okay, well, clearly, her and Han are over until they find each other again 4 years later, whatever it is. And, you know, they have a lot of not a lot, but they have a few of these things that they can explore without Han and Chewie, because then you have Enfys Nest too. And,
Yes.
she asks Han to join her rebellion, basically. And he's like, no, not really my thing. And,
Yep.
that right there is just funny in itself, because you're like, yeah, but you end up there anyway. So, you do you
Right.
for now, Han.
Yep. You're destined to it. Go get your skills together, and then we'll see you in a little while. You'll be back. And I liked how, like I said, like I felt so conflicted about it, but a big part of me really liked that they gave um, Kira her own thing, her own story, and her own motivation that was never about Han. I thought that was a good choice, but it wasn't really an obvious choice at first, which
Right.
isn't a bad thing, but it definitely, you have to think about it to really see it, I think.
I think it helps that she sort of always had this idea that she wouldn't be able to leave too, because Han kept trying to convince her to just leave. And she's like, you really don't understand, dude. Like, that's not a
Right?
thing that's going to happen. So it was really nice to see how, she already knew sort of what was going to happen. But then as things progressed and she ended up stabbing Dryden, it's like, okay, now what does she do? Because obviously she's lying about what happened. So if she ever gets caught in a lie, this is not going to end well for her. But if she
Right.
doesn't, where what side is she on? Is she on the good side, the evil side? What's going on with her character? And I think she's a really interesting addition too, along with Enfys Nest and Beckett. And I have talked about this on a previous podcast before, but with this isn't exactly a superhero movie, but I feel like it still gets lumped in with Marvel and DC when you're talking about these big blockbuster movies that a lot of people will go see. They're not just labeled as, like this space opera or superhero movie. For me, Solo was pretty much a heist movie. That's
Yes, I
that's the
agree.
whole goal
100%.
of this movie. It's like, okay, they have to go steal this stuff that is very dangerous and very explosive and get it to someone. And, there's a buyer, there's a seller, and what have you. And none of that happens, but they still end up stealing the thing. So, it's just a big heist movie. And I feel like for a heist movie, this was a good heist movie.
I agree. I thought those were the best parts of it when you're watching the heist happen and the planning and all of that, and the original crew, Beckett's crew that he gets with, and Tandy Newton was amazing, and I would have loved to see more of her in this film. But I think when it was being a heist film, it really knew its strengths and it pushes those, and it makes it. It's the most thrills that you get in the whole movie, other than maybe at that very end scene when they're, actually. Well, I suppose that's the culmination where the heist goes bad almost, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. And I know you wanted to talk about betrayal as a theme in this movie. And I feel like with a heist movie, betrayal is highly likely too, because
Yep.
you have such high stakes, especially with what they were going after. And I'm totally blanking on the name of it at the moment, but it was very rare and very hard to get, so they only had this one shot to get it, and then they sort of butcher that and have to figure something else out and have to get it in an even more unstable condition and then stabilize it. And it's just this whole big ordeal because of these people coming in and betrayal after betrayal. And what did you think of the moment where Han did shoot first? I want to be sure we get to that. So we'll come back to the betrayal thing in a moment because this kind of ties into it too.
I think that was a huge growth moment for Han. I think that is where we start to see Han turning into the person he becomes, where he has digested the lesson that, you know, Harrelson's character is trying to teach him to never trust anyone. I think he he learns it then, and he finds it and takes it into himself and allows it to change him. And I thought that moment was just one of the strongest choices he makes in the film. I was like, yes, this is what you do. He would have killed you. There was no doubt.
Plus, Beckett even tells him that. He's like, I would have pulled the trigger, sort of thing, too.
Yep.
So he's like, good for you. And, like you said, it's this big growth moment for him. And it's sort of really hard to do that to someone he looked up to for a period of time, no matter how short of a period of time it was in the movie. It's like he was like, okay, this guy, I'm going to do this one job. And then it turned into, you know what, maybe I could do this some more, because they even go back to that at the end. And he's like, there's this gangster. And
Yep.
then, the movie ends shortly thereafter. And you're like, okay, obviously we know where Han and Chewie are going next. And there's sort of this underlying theme in Star Wars where killing your mentor is a thing you tend to do, or try to do at least.
Yeah.
So I thought to have it be Han and Beckett instead of, like Jedi or Sith or what have you, it just made it feel a little more real, because you're like, okay, these are just two dudes trying to get by. They're not, Jedi or Sith. They don't have any powers. They're just dudes with blasters.
Right. And I think it cements the concept for their, among the many rerunning themes in Star Wars. It cements this idea that in order for growth to happen, like, there must be death. And I think that particular scene, because like you said, they're not Jedi, they're not Sith, and it's not even really about good or evil at that point. It's just he just wants to get away. And neither of them is necessarily good or evil. They're complex men, but they still have to live out this same message and learn it in order to move on and make, growth in their lives. Well, Han gets to grow, Beckett gets to die.
Yeah, exactly. And, that sort of brings us into the various deaths for the movie, too. So you have Beckett, you mentioned Val. We didn't get to see a whole lot of her because she dies during the initial heist attempt, and she sacrifices herself so that they can pull off the heist, which doesn't even happen. So then you just get this feeling in your gut. You're like, oh, she pretty much died for nothing. But, at least she died doing what she loved, kind of, sort of. I mean, you could have just saved her because you didn't get the stuff anyway.
Yeah, and that was a really, like, it was a moment where it was like, no, Tandy Newton, she's so great. I love this character. It's such an opportunity for her, and such a someone you want to see more of, and then it's cut short, and it feels like, I think I kind of fit when that happened. I was like, oh, this is going to be a hard movie. All these people are going to die, because it kind of foreshadows it. Because if she's dying, who's like his closest confidant, then who's going to make it out alive?
Exactly. That moment, too, reminded me of Daredevil season 1 when they kill off Ben Urich, and it feels like it's way too soon. I'm like, hold up, what are you doing? Why are you killing him? And you sort of miss his presence after that because, he was such a great reporter, and you're like, okay, yeah, sure, Karen's great sometimes, but, she's no Ben Urich. And it sort of felt like that for me because I was like, oh, I think they did this a little too soon.
Right. And is it a purposeful choice? Or was it just like, somebody's got to die, let's pick her? And it kind of felt purposeful, just because, more so because Kasdan wrote it, and he's a pretty purposeful writer. But Also because that's kind of the thing that Star Wars does. Like, they allow people to die, and it is hard, but it motivates the other characters. And it certainly, I felt like, I totally agree with you about how you feel like they're missing, because those heists would have gone way better if she'd been there.
Right. Yeah, it's just one of those things where you're like, okay, I can understand how this decision could have easily gone either way, and you have to pick one. She can't be half dead and half alive. It's not
Right.
a halfway thing that you can do. You either do it all the way or not at all. And, I understand the choice. I was just sort of hoping to get to know her a little more. We do have that nice moment when they're sort of all sitting around talking and sort of getting to know each other. But other than that, you're like, okay, how much do we really know about this character? And who knows? For all we know, she could show up in one of the novels, like we've seen happen with a lot of other secondary characters for specific stories. Because, I recently read Thrawn by Timothy Zahn, and it had Governor Price, and the two of them show up in the Rebels show. So I was like, okay, I'm familiar with these characters, but it was really nice to sort of see that history and how those two ended up meeting, even though Price wasn't necessarily as important of a person as Thrawn by any means. So maybe we'll see something like that down the line. But with her and Beckett dead, I'm not entirely sure how that would happen.
Yeah, that kind of, it cuts off so many avenues, and it kind of feels very, it makes it more sad, because it's such a waste. Like, oh, this was such a cool person, and now they're just gone. And it's in keeping with the fairly bleak sentiments of the beginning of the movie. That even with that first initial scene where Han just has to leave her behind, Kira just gets to stay there, and then we see what happened to her. And this one felt like it was willing to embrace the darkness just a little bit and show a little more of the sad realities of what living in that kind of universe would be.
Yeah, Val wasn't the only one to die during that heist, though, either. You have Rio, I believe,
Yes, yes.
and, he is up in the ship trying to help them get away with everything. And, the other people board the ship, and he ends up getting shot. And, you see Han go up there, and you can just tell right away once you see Rio, you're like, nope, this is not ending well.
Nope. No, people, that guy is not coming back. He's not going to make it. And you kind of watch the realization come onto Han's face, and he's like, oh, he'll be okay. Oh, he's not going to be okay. And you watch him go through this, like, he's watching somebody die as he has to save people. And I felt like Aaron Reich did a really good job with that moment, because you really felt how hard it must be to watch something like this while you're in a life and death situation.
Exactly. I have one other question I want to ask you about Han. How did you feel about his overall positivity that things were going to work out, when we first are on Corellia and he's like, I'll find you. And even though it takes so long, he does by accident though. And, then he's like, oh, okay, well, let's just get out of here. He's sort of naive in a sense because he hasn't experienced all of the things that he has by the time we see A New Hope or any of the other movies in the original trilogy. And you're just like, oh, this is a very different Han than we're used to, but you still see glimpses of the same person. It's like, he still has that same kind of charming personality, and he's going to be up for whatever, basically.
Yeah, I mean, even in the beginning, if he feels a little goofy almost, which is something that's so very far from like the cool as cucumber Han Solo who knows how to get out of everything that we see in New Hope. I think at the beginning I was like, what are we doing? How are they gonna turn this kid into, the character that he becomes? And I was curious if they would be able to make that, thread that needle, as it were. And slowly throughout the film, he changes a little bit, not much, but then at the very end, after the Kessel Run and stuff, when he is betrayed, he has to deal with, his mentor trying to kill him, and he has to kill the guy, and now he's got to figure it out. It's a hell of a transformation at the end. And I think they made it work. They made it seem more sensible, and it felt like he lost a little bit of that like naivete and that goofy swagger that he has, and starts to develop more of a like cocky swagger to hide the internal conflict that he's.
We do see him start to figure out how to talk his way out of things too, because we see that when they come back to Dryden empty handed and he just starts talking and sort of looking to Beckett and Kira and having them help him out along the way. But he does end up talking Dryden out of killing all of them pretty much.
Right. And I thought, and then he manages to keep all of the attention on him and pull off almost everything they wanted. And I think, he does that in the very beginning when he, makes it off the planet with the coaxium. That's what it's called.
Yes, there we go.
And he's not very good at it in the beginning, and you see him get better at it. And I thought that last scene where he does talk Beckett out of it, or not Beckett, he talks Dryden out of it. It was like, it felt like a test. It was like, all right, buddy, if you want to get everybody out alive, you're going to have to use these skills that you've learned from, playing Sabak with Lando and dealing with Kira in this entirely new way and dealing with these mercenaries. And it was a cool growth moment for him as well. Like the ending of that movie is just all him growing up, essentially.
Yeah, and like I said at the top of the episode, I went into this not really having a ton of expectations for it. And while it is a fun movie, I don't know if fun necessarily makes a movie great either. I think, by the time I walked out of the theater, I was like, oh, yeah, that was a perfectly fine movie. I think I gave it like a 3 out of 5 on Letterboxd, which to me, a 3 out of 5, that's fine. It's not horrible.
Yep.
It's not fantastic. And I was like, yeah, that seems right. And, talking about it now, I think Solo might be something I would rewatch just for the heist aspect of it. Like, I really enjoy heist movies. I still need to go see Ocean's 8, speaking of heist movies, but
Yep.
it's one of those things where sometimes you can just sit back and have fun with movies like that. It's, like I said, the Ocean series, Baby Driver, what have you. It's just like, okay, heist movies, maybe not going to be 5 stars out of 5 stars ever, but you're going to have fun while you're watching them. And I think sometimes, that's okay. And because you and I both write about movies, it's like sometimes you just want to sit back and enjoy a movie without feeling like you have to be overly critical about it.
Right. And so engaged and like looking at it on all these levels, like you can, and Solo is nice in that, and that you can look back on it and like, okay, well, there was a lot kind of going on there. And I think they made a good choice when they tapped Ron Howard to pick that, because Ron Howard, like, he's made some okay movies and he's made some really great movies, but I can't think of one that's just like truly terrible. Like, and in all of his movies, there's moments of greatness. And I think this was definitely a Ron Howard movie. And I liked that about it. And I walked out feeling the same. I was like, that was fine. That was fine. I didn't feel, I was engaged the whole time, had some fun, had some laughs, but it wasn't, I wasn't moved. But I do now sit back and think about it and have some stuff to ponder. And that is, that's saying something for what it is, I think.
Yeah, there's one big section of the movie that we haven't talked about just yet, and that's the Kessel Run. So I was sort of saving this as one of the last things because this is the moment where, we get to see Han take over and pilot the Millennium Falcon, and then Chewie ends up jumping into the co-pilot seat when Kira's like, yep, no, I don't know where any of the stuff you're asking for is. So she just like gets up and she's like, Chewie, here you go. And it's just one of those moments where we knew this was going to happen at some point, and they didn't make a really, really big deal about it. You sort of see this smirk on Han's face when he gets to pilot, and then, Chewie is just so Chewie in that moment that he hops into the seat and he just like starts doing everything. And you have the moment where Han learns that Chewie is 190 in the movie too, which I think that was a great moment between the two of them.
Yes, I agree. I think that was also I felt like, okay, there's no surprises coming in this. Like, we know he makes it. We know he does a great job at it. But I didn't really feel like there was any climactic energy to it, even though that's obviously kind of what it was it was trying to send that message, even though the real climax comes afterwards. But it was fun to watch and fun to see it all play out as they become like partners, like true partners, as they learn how to manipulate this ship through this incredibly dangerous journey. So I was captivated by it, even though I was like, well, I know what happens, but I still want to see this.
Yeah, the Kessel Run is something that we have known about for a very long time at this point. And, I was a little worried that it might feel like shoehorned into the movie, but it didn't. It made total sense. I was like, oh, yeah, of course this is what it is. Of course it's the first time that he pilots the ship. It's like it sort of all just fell into place with what you would expect from Han Solo. And, by the time they get to where they're going, the Falcon is so trashed that you could tell that once Han takes it from Lando, which obviously happens later because we see Lando leave in it.
Right.
And, it's just this beautiful, beautiful ship when Lando shows them around and they're going around, going to the Cape Room and this, that, and the other thing. But, when Han has it, you're like, oh, that piece of junk. And,
Yes.
that's even been said in other Star Wars movies. So it's just so funny how we see it in this pristine condition. And then, when Han takes it over, it's like, yeah, no, I don't really need all of this fancy stuff. So we're just going to beat the crap out of the ship.
Right. And he just has no care. It's a tool to him. He has got places to go, no time to, be safe about it. And that was so fun to watch. I was like, I wonder what happened when I saw how like clean and beautiful it looks. I'm like, how long did it take for it to get so dingy? And then you learn about 2 days.
Yeah, if that. It's like one time Han flies it and it's done for.
Yep. And yet he somehow manages to keep it going for quite some time.
Yeah, I think that might be the more impressive part, that it actually still works for Rey in The Force Awakens.
Right? Especially when you see how it looks there. It's like, how is this ship still going? This is insane. Like they must make things, considering the rapid rate of technological, decline in our society, where your phone lasts a year and a half and then it's dead. It's like they're really building stuff to last there.
Yeah, exactly. And while Han is piloting too, that is when we have L3 being uploaded into the ship, basically, and she becomes the Siri of the ship, so to speak. And,
Right.
does that make the death of L3's physical droid form a little less painful for you? Because, you see how much it affects Lando, and you're like, okay, well, she's still part of the ship. So I think that eases up the pain a little bit, especially for Lando, because it's like, okay, she's still there technically.
Yeah, like I felt like it made more sense how the ship is so amazingly good at getting through places, and why it's so persnickety about things throughout the entire series. So I was like, okay, this is a good choice. And then I read an article about it, about the how removing her brain from her body and then putting it in the ship has, taken all of her agency away. And it made me think about it slightly differently. I was like, how do I feel about this? And I still don't know, but I thought it was an interesting point that, she's such a independent droid and she's fighting for freedom, but then she has that choice taken away from her at the end. But it saves Lando. So would she choose that for herself, or so it's an ethical question that I'm sure the movie didn't consider, but it's certainly fun to think about.
Definitely. Well, is there anything we haven't touched on yet that you want to hit on before we start to wrap things up here?
I don't think so. I think we got through most of the stuff that was on my mind about the movie.
Yeah, me too. And because I saw it fairly recently, I'm pretty confident we got through all of the big things here. And like I said, it'll be interesting to see if they pick up the Darth Maul and Kira storyline somewhere else, or, what ends up happening, because I think they signed on for 3 movies. I think I read that somewhere, but it doesn't necessarily say they have to be a solo trilogy. So it'll be interesting to see what happens with that. And as you and I both know, Hollywood is very weird, so anything can happen at any given time.
Yeah, and they have talked about making a Lando movie, and that I would go see no matter how bad it is, just to watch Donald Glover do his amazing skills on screen again. Um, but that would be interesting, and I would definitely watch a movie about Kira. She seems like an utterly fascinating character.
And it probably wouldn't be a bad thing to necessarily have a female led movie. Just saying. Star Wars.
No, I could handle 5, 6, 7 more of those. That'd be great in the Star Wars universe. We might be about par then.
Exactly. Well, Katie, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Solo. We will definitely have you back on for more Star Wars and other movie talk. I'm sure you and I will be brainstorming pretty shortly after we're done here about what we'll
Awesome.
talk
That
about
sounds
next.
sweet. That sounds awesome. Thank you so much for having me on. It was fun.
Of course. And as always, thank you to our listeners, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.